Hello, everybody, and welcome to the In-Case webinar. Before we begin, I would like to thank our partner, Accenture, for making these webinars happen. Now, the In-Case webinar series was launched by Digital at INSEAD as a live case discussion. These webinars tend to deep dive into cases published by INSEAD together with its case protagonists, industry experts, and always presented by the INSEAD faculty. Now, INSEAD is a current leader in case publishing and produces actually about 70 to 80 new cases per year. Now, in the case by Digital at INSEAD spans a whole range of different kinds of topics on global digital transformation. And this provides a unique opportunity for many industry practitioners to really enjoy the INSEAD teaching firsthand. Now, if you want to look at this more, you can find INSEAD's case collection of about 2,000 cases at publishing.insead.edu. Now, before we get started to talk about the case study that we wrote together, I want to just go over a couple of housekeeping rules here. Now, the audience here is muted, and all the video and chat functions actually have been disabled. So should you have questions, and please do have questions for our speakers, use the Q&A tab. Now, when you do write your questions, think about them for a second, try to keep them short and to the point. Now, for all of us to be able to identify the most relevant questions, you can vote. You can upvote different questions that you see there on the Q&A tab. Now, as a final word, I want to mention that this webinar is being recorded. And if along the way you encounter any technical issues, you can always email us at digital@insead.edu. So that's for the housekeeping rules. Now to kick things off here a little bit, Antoine, may I invite you to show yourself and present yourself briefly?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ville. So my name is Antoine. I'm an assistant professor of technology and operations management at INSEAD, where my research is about trying to leverage deep learning to revisit topics like better understanding customer prediction demands, as well as solving decision problems such as pricing or solver optimization. And I teach on topics around operations as well as analytics here at INSEAD. So, yeah. And I'm very excited to be here with you today. Back to you, Ville.
Thanks, Antoine. Yeah, since I didn't introduce myself in the beginning, why don't I do it now? So my name is Ville Satopaa. I'm an associate professor in the Technology and Operations Management group. Been at INSEAD for about 8 years now. Now my background is in statistics, so I've been doing research in various areas of predictive analytics and probabilistic learning. These are the kind of topics that we find in the backbone of the AI that we see in the media that we talk about today. Now at INSEAD, I do teach topics related to AI as well, and of course, operations and statistics. Now, on that note, let me just give you a sort of a short prelude of how I would use this case study that we're going to be talking about today, and how do I set the stage in the classroom. So as we all know, we're here to talk about a case that we wrote together with Antoine and Eric. It's called To Catch a Thief, Explainable AI in Insurance Fraud Detection. This is a case study about a company that is based in Paris. It's called Shift Technologies. And in short, what they're doing is that they're using machine learning technology to try to help insurance companies that act as their clients to detect fraud, right? And it's interesting to think about how one will go about this. Can we have the next slide? And the one actually after, we can go straight to that. Thank you. So how would you really go about this in this sort of a naive way? How would you build a machine learning model in this kind of a supervised setting to predict fraudulent behavior? Now, it's important to think about how one will go about this. Now, we here in the case study focused on car insurance cases, and we actually have a real world data set included in the case study. So this is something that the Shift Technology offered us. I think it has about 11,500 real world cases. Now, for each one of them, as you can see here on the slide, we have a target variable. This is what we're trying to predict. So this will be whether that case was found to be fraud or not. So it's a 0 or 1. And then we have all kinds of attributes, features for each one of these individual claims. This would include things like date of the claim, age of the vehicle. We had notes from the insurance company. I believe we even had notes from the police, if I remember correctly, and claimed amount and so forth. So a simple sort of a supervised way of doing this would be to just find a mapping from all these features, right? Maybe using deep learning technology or many other type of machine learning architectures that would give us a very sort of efficient mapping from those features to whether we think that's going to be fraud or not. So the ultimate output from a model like this will be, as an example, something like, here's a case with these type of features, and we believe it is fraud with, say, 70% probability. That's what you will get if you sort of straight plunged into this problem. But quite quickly, you realize that this may not be exactly what you want to do. This may not be the way you can actually deliver the most amount of business value. And this is actually not at all what Shift did. So Shift had here a big Eureka moment, as we like to call it, and this is what allowed them to be very successful. So instead of me talking about that, we're going to have Eric talk about that. So Antoine, why don't I hand this back to you, and you can introduce Eric.
All right. So yeah, I think we can stop the slides perhaps, or yeah. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Eric to the webinar. Eric is the co-founder and the chief scientific officer of Shift Technology, and as a leader of an organization which is at the forefront of innovation, AI, and analytics, we are very excited to have him share some of his thoughts on what they have been up to, as well as what are your thoughts on the recent excitement and development around AI and generative AI. I'm also personally very excited to welcome Eric. I've known Eric for quite some time. We go back, we've been good friends for more than 20 years now. So it's a true pleasure to have him and have been able to witness his impressive career. So just to give you a small anecdote, so after he graduated from École Polytechnique, not only did he start Shift, he also was doing a PhD in machine learning at the same time. So most of us are struggling to do one of these things, but he actually was doing both of these things at the same time. So Eric, just to, Ville set the problem very nicely. And I think there's an echo, or is it just me? Or okay, so, and so one could think about fraud detection just as a typical classification problem where you have lots of data, you have a label that you want to predict, 1 or 0. And so, a naive question is, why not just apply some kind of off-the-shelf black box machine learning prediction? And so can you tell us what's wrong with such an approach and what did you do differently?
Hello. Thank you, Antoine, for the kind introduction. Thank you for having me here. So I'm one of the co-founders of Shift, and I lead Chief Science, Chief Product Officer. And so to answer your question, Antoine, I think the starting point is to have a good understanding of the problem that we are solving. So at Shift, we only focus on insurance, and so I will talk about insurance fraud detection. That's the focus. But just for this first question, maybe we can look at another example, because my point is that depending on the use case, the solution may be different. So if you look at examples in e-commerce or in banking, where you can have fraud as well, but then the fraud there typically would be about credit card fraud. So meaning someone, steals a credit card and then buys something with it. Then in these situations, most often the problem at stake is to be able to detect and stop immediately. In these situations, when it's about just stopping automatically the purchase, so that for example in e-commerce, then so that the fraudster cannot buy the product, they don't need necessarily to really have a lot of explanation, as long as it protects well. In insurance, it's completely different. In insurance, the fraud actually is part of the claim statement itself. Right, the insurance operations, so claims, it's the time where insurers will apply the insurance contract, and when they do so, so insurers have they are obliged to apply the contract, So they are obliged to cover the claimant if he's covered. And some of the claimants will introduce some lies, will commit fraud there. And so if ever the insurer is able to prove that there is a fraud, then they are allowed by law to deny. But it's really a legal perspective, and because it's a legal aspect, then they have to justify it. They don't always need to go to court. They don't always need to do all of that, but in a way, they need in their processes to, have enough facts and to justify in case, for example, they go to court. And that already starts like setting up the stage, because all of a sudden explainability is the need for explainability is completely different.
Mm-hmm. And so can you give us maybe, just at a high level, how does your approach differs from just, maybe a naive black box prediction model problem?
Yes. So once we fully understand that, okay, how does it change in terms of how does it impact the model? So and what happened is that in our history, the first approach we had was this more, let's say, naive machine learning approach, exactly as Ville described, trying to fit a model to try to predict if a case would be a fraud or not, based on historical data provided by insurers. The issue when you do this is that you can have models. You will try to interpret from the models, you will try to interpret the weights that have been statistically fitted on the data. And the thing is, these weights mean something, but they mostly have a mathematical meaning. And it's very hard to derive from there a concrete explanation that can justify each case one by one. Potentially, you can say, when you look at these models, if you do, for example, linear regression, like a linear logistic regression, you can see from the data that maybe some characteristic can be a much better indicator than others. And that can tell you something about, let's say, the phenomenon in a way, but it will never tell you precisely why this case is suspicious. You see, like, it's not, if you take the example of like a geographic area, it could happen that in some geographic areas, there are much more fraud, but it will never be an argument that is sufficient enough to then justify that a case is a fraud. And then even if you combine multiple factors that are each statistically irrelevant, it doesn't make the case. So the approach we've gone for is actually to realize that we're not trying to predict if a case is suspicious or not. We're trying to predict why a case is suspicious or not. It's a change of one word, but when you say it like this, then all of a sudden, we're not doing a binary prediction. We are trying to have a much more detailed prediction about actually so why do we think it's suspicious? Meaning, what is mostly the modus operandi that we are suspecting? And so all of a sudden, the problem is much more relevant to the business use case, but it's also much more difficult because it's more complex. It's not just a binary prediction. And also a big problem is that these modus operandis are usually not labeled in the data.
I see. And so, so explainability is really at the heart of what you're doing. And you explained that basically it's because the insurance company need to understand why you are flagging these claims as fraudulent. And I think for you it was always at the heart of your solution, but the topic of explainability, in fact, only recently emerged with all this new technology like deep learning, and only now that we see algorithms taking over many aspects of our lives, from hiring decisions to helping with medical diagnosis. People are starting to care about this topic. So given your experience of in terms of implementing such explainable solutions, are there any lessons or principles that you think could be helpful for other people, maybe in the audience, that are thinking about this dimension as they're developing the machine learning based solution?
Yeah. So first, I think there are several topics about explainability, and maybe there's a first one. So there is one big question about deep learning and also now the big LLMs, which is almost a kind of a philosophical question, which is, why is that working? Because if you take LLMs, for instance, it all starts from a very simple problem, which is you have a sentence and you're predicting the next word. That's how the models are trained. That was the starting point. Now it's a bit more sophisticated than that, but it doesn't go much further. And how do you train a model to just predict the word, like the next word? How by training a model to do this, then all of a sudden the model is able to answer complex questions with complex answers in a very, very good way. That's something actually nobody knows. But I would say but then the question is, do we need to know? Well, that's maybe that's a philosophical, or maybe for science it's interesting, but for technology, even Sam Altman was saying we don't really need to know why it's working. What we need to know from their perspective, from these guys, OpenAI, what they need to know is how to improve their models. And here they don't know exactly how to improve, but they know quite a lot. I mean, they've done a lot of progress at every version. They know in general that if they increase the size, it will work better. Nobody knows, right, if artificial general intelligence will be there with GPT-5 or 6 or 7. Nobody knows, but it looks like every time it goes that it comes much better and better and better. So they're just always trying to optimize, and they discover. So I think that's one first part of explainability, which is more at the level of the generic model itself and how you learn. So I'm sure that OpenAI and the other players that work on these big models, they have a fair understanding of what's happening when they train them, even if they don't fully understand, I would say, the science behind. Now, the other part of explainability or interpretability that I think is the other big topic is more the one that we have, and I'm sure there are that in many other applications, where I was saying in our application for insurance fraud, claims insurance fraud, we need to be able to explain for one specific claim why this one is suspicious. So it's not about how did the model learn, it's more once the model is there, how is it justifying this? And for this one, well, with my experience, based on what I was explaining before, if I can kind of try to generalize, it comes down usually to that fact that when we need explainability, it's usually that the problem is actually more complex than what we thought. It's usually not just about predicting one thing, but it's actually predicting more. If you take an example, it's not the best, maybe in those times, but it's an obvious one of like a robot that would do war, like a drone who could fire automatically. You can train the robot to fire on targets that are dangerous, but what you would really want to have is you wouldn't want to be able to justify, in case you need to justify the actions, why the robot considered it as dangerous. So actually, you don't want to train the robot just to say if a situation is dangerous or not. You would want to train the robot to explain what in a situation makes it dangerous. And all of a sudden, it's much more complex. But it's also what we do as humans when we learn at school, at university, right? We're not just predicting things. We learn in order to explain. And I think the more we build complex AI systems, the more this is where it's going. In our approach, the solution we found to do this, I would say, is mostly specific to insurance. So we don't have like a silver bullet for everything. But the general principle, I would say, is to acknowledge that the problem is actually more complex, that it's about predicting the explanation itself, not just the result, and then find the ways to do it.
And I think it's, you mentioned we also sometimes as human have a hard time explaining, and I think it's in terms of interpretability, like sometimes it feels like, are we more unforgiving with algorithms that we are for human? Like, are we setting a higher threshold for algorithms, or maybe should we have a higher threshold for algorithms? What do you think?
I think we have a different threshold, in the sense that all as humans, we have some kind of common sense, a human common sense. We not all exactly have the same, but our common sense is very different from the common sense of a robot that is learning. And so sometimes there are things which are very obvious to us, where the robot, the AI, would be wrong. And then we're saying, but then the AI is just like, it's really bad. Look, it made this mistake. Whereas like anyone would know this is just obviously wrong. And that's, well, that's a bias that we have because that's the way it is. We don't, nobody knows how humans have learned, and it's probably some kind of, shared learning across the millions of years of evolution that we don't know about. And so on that part, should we or should we not? I don't know, but probably like if you think of like a product perspective that you're selling, obviously you cannot control the users, and so that the users will be there. And by the way, we have that as well. Our own users, we don't have that many users because we sell to insurance companies, to the specific teams, but we have a total like thousands of users in the world. But usually they have that bias as well. So we need to have some, we have some specific approaches to sometimes avoid making mistakes that are considered too big, even if it's just one mistake. Like one mistake is just one mistake from a KPI perspective, and a very big obvious mistake has indeed a bigger psychological impact.
Yeah, and it goes back to the idea of explainability. I think one reason why we want our models to be interpretable or explainable sometimes it's also to build trust, right? If I understand why you're making the decision, I'm more inclined to trust the output of the model, right? I know you've been expanding quite a bit recently, both geographically, like launching your product into other countries, as well as across different insurance types. So can you comment on how do you make sure your models or your algorithms are scalable while being maybe tailored or respecting the specificities of each different countries or each different types of insurance?
So we have multiple products at Shift, but even if we only focus on claims fraud detection, which is our core product, we do indeed have different versions, if I say, across countries and also across lines of business. So for us, lines of business being different types of insurance, whether it's auto insurance, property insurance, health insurance, obviously it's different, right? So we have different models, but also per country, it will change because in the end, we are detecting modus operandis, which sometimes some of them will depend on the insurance ecosystem of the country, and therefore will only apply in one country and not in another, or the local regulation, the local players. So in order to do that, we've built the way we found is that our detection model, in a way, is a big pipe where there's a lot of steps and a lot of modules, and not everything is generic, obviously. So we have some generic layers and some of them which then have that specific flavor. In order then to be able to apply it to each country differently, then we have a specific layer to take that into account, which is a combination of more like business knowledge that is translated somehow into some kind of rules, and then a combination of learning on the data that is specific to that country. So it does mean that when we go to a new country, then, so what it means in more like, when we go to a new country, it can work. I mean, it does work from the start, but it's lacking some specifics of the country, and with time, then we add them. So yeah, so then another thing is, in our history, from the start, we had the opportunity to work in many countries. It was great for us. It was great to show that our product was a global product and we had a global business. Now today, we are more in a situation where we have a lot of countries, something around 20, which is good for us. There are good markets, and now we are more focusing on these 20 countries.
Just a quick follow-up question, as you're having data from all these countries. And so, as you said, part of your approach is to define those modi operandi or the suspicious behaviors. Do you see, and I guess some of it is driven by the type of contract that they have, but like in terms of people's behavior, do you see similarities or difference across countries? Like, do people fraud differently in the US than in Japan, for instance?
So there are some similarities. There are some patterns that you find everywhere. To find everywhere, like not there are always exceptions. So to give you some examples, in auto insurance, there is quite a common pattern about total losses, So total loss is about if a theft or a fire. So the pattern is more that the policyholder has a vehicle which is actually not working anymore, or it's had a lot of breakdowns, and therefore the policyholder is trying to sell the vehicle. And then in this pattern, then the policyholder doesn't manage to sell it, and therefore instead of selling it, will just either like stage a theft or stage a fire and then report that to the insurer. So it's a fraud because then the theft or the fire is not really an accident. It was due to him. It's a voluntary thing, so that's not covered. But of course, they will say that they don't know how it happened, and this arises in many countries. There is at least one exception I can think of. It's Singapore. Singapore is different because if you want to have a car in Singapore, you need to pay very high for something that's called a certificate, like several hundreds of thousands of dollars. And because of that, then there are very, very few thefts and fires. So you cannot just say, oh, my car was stolen, because then it's not like something common. And so you cannot use it as a wrong story. So that's one example. Other examples in the US, there's actually a big part of the fraud in auto insurance actually relates to healthcare. But because the healthcare system in the US is huge, I mean, it's not the reason, but in the end, that's why the system is huge. But from the facts, like it's several trillion in premiums, healthcare insurance in the US. It's 70% of healthcare insurance in the world, just this country alone. And it has gone crazy. And it's a kind of a race where providers will always increase their prices, will always bill for more, and insurers, called payers, will just pay for more. And including in the car accident, then you can end up with just hundreds of thousands of dollars, whereas in another country it would just be like, I don't know, $5,000 or $10,000. And so because of that, then you have this kind of fraud rings between healthcare providers across car accidents that you will not really find in other countries. And then you have you have a lot of stuff patterns that you can find in multiple countries but not others, and these are just a few examples.
All right, thank you. And I think your example in Singapore is very much on point, and I think all of our colleagues and friends in Singapore will relate to that. So thank you. So just to say that I teach this case to MBA students, and Ville mentioned that we have a big data set of more than 10,000 claims, and so they always like to engage with this data set, play detective, and try to detect which are the fraudulent case. And it's also a great way to illustrate how whenever you deal with data, and as you said, complex problem, there are always many dimensions that one needs to think about, and it's never one solution that's going to dominate all of the others across all dimensions. And so I think having them experience those trade-offs is great for them. And maybe Ville, you want to add a few things about how you use this case in your teaching. I know you use this case for a slightly different audience.
Yeah, sure. So whereas Anton, you teach it largely to MBA students, I've been using this case in my teaching for the executive students. And there are typically two different points that I'm trying to deliver when I talk about our case study. The first one, which had already been mentioned a few times, is that when you're thinking about applying AI in your company, you really need to start by thinking about the actual business case. What is it actually that you need to solve that would deliver value for you? And then go from there to finding the actual AI machine learning solution, right? So here is a very nice case of that, because if you naively go at it, like we explained in the beginning, you don't get these kind of interpretations that you could then hand over to the insurance companies to explain to them, look, this is why we think it's suspicious, right? So here what Shift and Eric did was that they flipped it all on its head, right? To look for those typical kind of suspicious behaviors that you call scenarios, and then try to predict them. So when you do it like that, then you already have an interpretation automatically coming out of the system. So whereas the earlier system could say something like, well, here's a case that is fraudulent for 70% probability, that's not very helpful. That doesn't give you guidance where to go next. Now, what you could have is a specific scenario that could say something like, here is a case that is fraudulent of this type with probability 70%, right? So that's really like, that gives a lot of direction. So that's one thing. Now, this leads to a second thing that I also like to emphasize in my teaching is that when you are trying to drive these kind of AI projects, you should always think about them as a collaborative effort between the people who truly understand the business and then the people who understand the data science, right? And here again, what happens is that you have the people who understand data science, and you need to then talk to the insurance companies who are much experts on what type of fraud is out there, what are we like to actually see in the wild, right? And then you can build those into the system to get those type of scenario predictions. So those are the two things that I usually talk about. Of this, what I thought next is to just ask Eric a couple of AI-related questions that, because a lot of things have happened actually since Eric, we wrote this case study. In particular, meanwhile, we now suddenly have all these generative AI, ChatGPTs and whatnot taking over the world. So what I wanted to ask you first is, have you adapted your solution in the light of these kind of generative AI-like tools that we have today? Do they play a role one way or another in the way you're doing fraud detection today?
Yes. So we've adapted them. I mean, we've included now the technologies in a very natural way for us. So in our pipe, when we process the data in order to get to the final result, there are some steps where we will process unstructured data. And mostly we're talking about free text descriptions and documents, which contain free text. So what we had in the past were NLP algorithms for free text understanding, or documents, we apply OCR on documents to extract the text, and then additional document parsing and NLP documents intelligent processing algorithms. So we had that in the past, and then they would output some characteristics, some features that then enter the model and then go their way. So the first thing we've done, which was very obvious and natural for us, was to replace these algorithms by generative AI. So that's what we do now, and so we're using generative AI in this sense, in a much simple way. We're just telling the generative AI, for example, look, here is a claim handler note. In the example you showed at the beginning, there was some very small extracts of that. So here's a claim handler note. Here's what the claim handler said on the claim, and can you extract this, and this from it? And it will do it, and it will do it much better than any NLP algorithm. So that's the first part. And by the way, by doing this, so we keep the rest. So the rest doesn't change. We keep the machine learning part at the end. But we also had machine learning at this stage. We had NLP models based on machine learning just to extract information from free text. And this has disappeared. So it's also interesting to see that with generative AI, somehow machine learning becomes useless. I mean, on the topics it's solving, it becomes useless, and the data scientist becomes useless. We often say that AI will replace a lot of jobs, for sure. The first one we don't think about is the data scientist. In particular, data scientists doing models to interpret free text and documents, probably it's just going to disappear, because the big LLMs have been trained once, or they are being improved by the big companies, and then we don't need to do anything. We just do a prompt and say, can you extract it for me? Whereas before, it would have taken us months of work gathering the data, checking up the labels, fine-tuning the models. Now we just write a prompt and it's working. So we just wanted to highlight that there is a first obvious impact on the data scientist roles, which is maybe not obvious for everyone.
Yeah, that's super interesting. There's in particular this idea that I think because of all the media attention around generative AI, many of us tend to think AI being equal to generative AI today. But what you're explaining is that, look, it's just a component of a much bigger system that still involves a lot of those classical sort of tried and true techniques from machine learning. Now, going off of that a little bit, and I'm piggybacking on something you said earlier, right? Where do you think things are going to go, right? So we know that now we see these revisions of large language models. They tend to get bigger. They tend to get a little bit better. But is there going to be some sort of diminishing returns to this? Are we going to hit some kind of a plateau? Do you think we're going to need a whole new different type of architecture to not just sort of to the next level or really get us to that artificial general intelligence? I know these are very difficult questions, but I would love to pick your brain and just hear what you think.
So maybe just first, just to come back on what I was saying and maybe clarify in one part. So with the rise of machine learning and AI in the years 2010s, we were in a situation where there was this very generic approach that you take a data set, like exactly like you explained at the beginning, right? You take a data set, you have your labels, you have a machine learning model. This still applies, in particular on the problems where you would not have a human able to answer right away. What we usually call predictive modeling for these predictive problems. And typically for a lot of specific applications, you can only have that. And you cannot replace that by generative AI. Generative AI, the big LLM models, they haven't done their own machine learning. So they cannot do that. They cannot predict. So we use the case of fraud here, but they cannot predict a certain number of quantities that you can do with these models. They haven't done that. It's not what they do. What happened, however, is that based on that, in the years 2010s, the topic was, okay, we now have this generic methodology. Where do we go from there? So everyone has said in the industry, well, it's easy. To every company, all companies have tried to apply it to their models. That's what has happened over the years in the 2020. But then in parallel, the scientific community was trying to tackle somehow more complex problems. And so if you look at, for example, image classification, 2012 was the first deep learning model applied to image classification. And it was applied to a simple problem with a big data set, ImageNet, with images that have a label. It was started with just like a cat or a dog, obvious example. And it was like all of a sudden it was working quite well, and very fast it became state of the art. So then the next step was, what do we do from there? Can we go to a more complex? So firstly, we can go to more complex, like it's one image and there's a lot of content in there. There is one cat and a dog and a zebra and whatever. But more than that, then it was, can you ask the algorithm to generate a sentence to describe the image? That was what they tried to do back in even 2015. I remember at a conference there, ICML, the International Conference for Machine Learning, they were saying, we've done that challenge. And so people were trying some models and we don't even know what we're trying to solve. Are we predefining all the captions, like all the image descriptions, and you need to select which ones? Or are we actually asking the model to generate this description? And obviously this was before generative AI. Now, obviously generative AI comes there and just generates the description. And it's now also even to do the opposite, right? You just write a description and it's generating the image for you. And in that sense, what generative AI has been able to do, so I was talking about free text and documents, it's much bigger than that. In our use case, we mostly apply it there, but we've seen that now it's working on images, obviously, but now also GPT-4o is also using videos and audio. What's a bit magical there is that there is a commonality there. Like they have a common model that somehow has understood the world. Not everything in the world. It hasn't understood, Einstein's theory of relativity, but it has understood the common world, like the basic world, the world that we all live in day to day. And so in their example, it has understood, like OpenAI was showing a video where it's understanding that someone is having their birthday party because the setup is a birthday party. Like all humans know what a birthday party is. And that's what's really impressive, is that the models now have these concepts, which are the generic basic human concepts, and they are able to use them and interpret them either from free text, from images, from sound, and reverse back, like either interpreting or generating. And this is really big. So it doesn't solve everything, but it's really big. It's not, for example, it's not predicting weather, right? But it's very big. And so where does it go from there? Nobody knows, right? So obviously you have big theories. So Meta with Yann Lequin, they are saying it will reach a plateau. The current architecture will not be able to progress. Whereas obviously OpenAI is not saying that. Who knows? Honestly, I personally don't have a I don't have a strong opinion, but I'm sure it will get solved. Whether it's a new architecture or not, the thing is, it has gone so fast. To me, the most impressive is not the success of ChatGPT itself, is how it has gone from GPT to GPT-4 in such little time, and now 4.0, and then there's GPT-5 coming. It's much faster than anything. And here, the pace of technology is fueled by the pace of technology adoption, because that's the thing. GPT 3.5 was trained on labels that they created. They paid a lot of people to create the labels. GPT-4, which is much better, they didn't have to pay anything. They just used the labels of the users, of us. And that's why they're going for GPT 4.0, because with 4.0, all of a sudden they will have labels on all channels, not just text. People will record videos and then they will have that. There's kind of a fight there, but they have that path. So there's more and more labels in the system, and there's more and more money put into the space. So this it's really hard to see how things could just stop. Like there's so many factors that to me it's much more likely to go much faster than actually slow down.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Now let me because I want to be mindful of time here. I want to give a little bit of time to the Q&As from the audience, but before that, I want to ask you one more question. Because every now and then you do see this discussion around regulations and, can Europe maintain its competitiveness here compared to, say, the US or China when we're put on under such strong, stringent regulations? Now, of course, France has seen a recent surge of many successful startups, such as Mistral, and President Macron is pushing France to be a leader in AI. Now, in what way are you being part of all these sort of country-level efforts? And what is your opinion? Does France stand a chance here?
So ours personally at Shift, we haven't spent that much time on that part. From our assessment, it doesn't fully impact us, but also we do business in the world. So the regulation doesn't apply everywhere in the same way. And same as Mistral, right? So I'm not an expert of all the details, but even a French company potentially working in the US, I'm not sure, I'm sure it will have the same limitations. But your question, I'm not sure the question is only about regulation, because there's also the question, does France or Europe stand a chance against US and China? And I would say the first question is, does it stand a chance against an ex-AI that has nothing else than just Elon Musk, who's able to raise 6 billion? 6 billion. It's huge, 6 billion. I mean, this is just like never seen in France. And yet Elon Musk's point was that an OpenAI raised significant amount, like similar amount of money. And so at some point there's kind of saying, look, it's simple. We've seen that to make good AI, you need big. So you need a lot of data, you need a lot of computing power. What do you need? Money. Point. Like they've just, where a part of the magic has arrived. They're like, it's not, you don't need really brains. Of course you need smart people to work there, but they've shown that if you do the PCA, ultimately the biggest factor to solve AI is money. And that's the point, like where clearly, I mean, France and Europe have money, but they don't have the same habit. Whereas some other countries like Japan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, there are some of these, but like in France and Europe, we don't have that mindset. But can it change? Probably. Just like unless someone's fine. So Mistral they've shown with success that even with less money, you can still have good performance. But they are more on the path of the, of the good trade-off for quality versus money, but they are still not as good, because if they had much more money, then it would be just better. So unless someone finds really a trick to make things much, much, much less expensive, then you have this big question of of money and how much investment we put in it.
Yeah, okay. That's interesting. Yeah, so it's not really so much a question about regulations. You would put on top of that a much bigger question around funding and getting more resources, computing power, right? I guess that's where a lot of this field is trying to move towards, is to make these cheaper, whatever that means, right? In terms of the computing power that is required. Yet at the same time, we talked about scale. So who knows where things are going to go. Okay, thank you, Eric. That's super interesting. Why don't I hand off to you, Antoine? We have now about a little over 10 minutes to hear a little bit about the kind of questions that our audience has given to us.
Yep, thanks both. So let's start with the first question, which is, I think, back to the first half of the session where you described your approach and the problem you were tackling. So the question is, in your case, how do you measure accuracy? In particular, what are the KPIs that you use to track the success of whether you help your client or not?
That's a very good one. So our situation is good because it's obvious, but you'll see it's not. It maybe doesn't sound obvious outside of it. So ultimately, for a client, when we detect claims fraud, we raise alerts so that then handlers can work with the alerts, and if it's a success, then they are able not to pay the claim. Meaning that it was indeed a fraud, and they're able to prove it. So ultimately, the key KPI for our clients, it's how much money they are able to make on top of what they were doing without us. So we call that fraud savings, or in the US, we would call that impact. So this is kind of the ultimate KPI, but it's not just on us, it's on the entire team, but it's still a key KPI for us. Our own KPI, precise, is more what we call our hit rate, which is when we send an alert, will they do an investigation on it? So will they say, oh yes, this is relevant enough so that it's worth for me to spend time on it, because it's likely that I will be able to make some savings with this. And so when you think about this, there's a huge load of subjectivity there. And we've seen that in practice. We have some clients where you just have a few users, and some of the users somehow work better with our tool. Then we see some big changes in our performance depending on who is on holidays. When a user that somehow likes our product is on holidays and the others don't, and they are here, then obviously our hit rate goes down because they're saying, no, this is not suspicious. When he gets back, he's saying, yeah, this is suspicious. That's unfortunate for us scientists. We would want something much more rigorous, but that's life.
And maybe a quick follow-up question on this, which is, wait, sorry, I lost the question now. Oh, this one. Yeah, which is, given that you say that your accuracy or KPIs is measured on, whether or not the clients ultimately say that it's a fraud or not, how do you market your tool to potential clients? What kind of metrics or ROI do you use?
Oh, we still use these two metrics. We use these metrics, and then we even say that we usually manage to get to a certain level. I mean, our standard official is like we managed to get to 75% hit rate. So meaning when we send an alert, 3 out of 4, they will consider it's worth spending time doing investigation, which is quite high in our setup. I mean, it could be seen as low, but it's compared to competition is quite high. And even for their use case, it is high. Now, there are this variability that I was talking about, but we have something around 150 clients in the world, insurance companies. And overall, we have indeed that on average.
Okay, thank you. So let me take the next question, which is, it has 2 parts. So let me ask the 2 parts and I'll let you answer. So the first one is, how do you maintain your differentiation in this competitive industry? And the next question is, do you think this kind of system can be extended for legal cases at courtrooms?
So differentiation is a big topic, but mostly 2 parts of the answer. One is always improving performance. And so we always do our R&D on that. How can we always just be better, improving the same KPIs, and in particular, including new technologies. So obviously using generative AI there is part of that. And we know it doesn't stop. It's gonna go much even faster in the future. Other part is more by expanding on other products. And our competitors do that as well, because there are other products that come and combine, and then at some point, having an entire suite of product for our clients becomes more sticky and becomes also a differentiation, because sometimes they want it all. So that's also a part of our strategy. Could we apply that to legal problems? Probably. I honestly don't know enough to say, but probably.
Okay, thank you. So let me go to the next question. So again, it has two parts. Let me start with the first one. How would this particular model identify deep fraud? So I'm not sure what the deep fraud means. I'm guessing perhaps it refers to like organized or hard fraud. Maybe that's what the question is referring to.
So it will detect certain number of various patterns. And then we also have, I didn't mention that, we have various types of algorithms as well, based on the type of data that we want to leverage or the type of information that we want to leverage. So we have, I would say, a base version, which is more like what Ville showed at the beginning, claim by claim. But we have another approach where we will not look at just one claim at a time. We will look at the entire data set, and we will look at it as a network. Some call it even a social network. It has nothing to do with Facebook, but it is, you can consider that as a social network where because from the data, you can derive people, you can recreate links between these people. And then based on that, you can detect patterns, which we have so dedicated models for that to detect in particular fraud rings or groups of people who organize fraud together.
And how would the system erroneously picking a claim as potential fraud, so false positive, then avoid making an unpleasant experience to an honest customer?
So like I said at the very beginning, but I didn't go fully. So we were not in a setting where based on what we say, the insurer will just fire right away. We only raise alerts to people. These people are the specialists on the insurance side who have their experience on analyzing these cases. If it is not suspicious, they will quickly see it and they will just say, no, it's not suspicious. And then the claim will just continue its route. So it will not bother the client. So that piece, so that's the good thing for us in a way is that it's controlled by these teams on the insurance side. So that's the umbrella.
Right. There's only a human in the loop before making that decision. There's another sort of different type of question, which is, what's your take on open source versus proprietary? And the question refers to your allusion to Yann Lequin, who I guess is a big defensor of the open source model.
So personally, yeah, I think it's great that there are people like Meta doing that open source. But it's, there is a financial equation, obviously. So I know this is the big strategy from Meta. I know Mark Zuckerberg said they will get to artificial general intelligence and they will make it open source, which means that they have the means to spend a lot of money and don't get a lot. Or you can always get money from open source, but not as much as not, right? So we saw that with Mistral. Mistral started with open source, and actually the strategy was to have an open source model so that they get known. But obviously from the start, they knew they would also have a payable version. So seen from Mistral that it's hard just to have one open source, you need money, and Meta can probably afford that because they have, they are comfortable behind that, and also probably because they have a strategy behind. The more it's there, then the more people will keep using Meta's product. So in the end, but it's really, it's great for society, because if no one was doing it, then you can be sure, for example, OpenAI wouldn't just leave ChatGPT, like a free version of ChatGPT, and it's always better to have more transparency.
Right. Also, I guess, as you said, for ChatGPT 4.0, I think they're making it free also to get more data, right? So I think it's also one reason why they decided to make it free. There's a question here on the data side. So the question goes like this. So do you work with insurance companies to develop processes that give more information that can be used in AI-based fraud processes, which may not have been practical when companies relied on manual fraud control? So the question is, how do you discover these new sources of data, and what sources of data are you seeing to be more useful, like pictures or text? Or I know you also work with sometimes satellite images.
So how we discover them, it can be, sometimes can be insurers who talk to us about it. A lot of them also would come from startups specialized on specific sources. There is one source that we've been talking a lot from, started like 15 years ago. It's telematics. So telematics in a car. So, data about the movement, the speeds, acceleration of the car. And obviously you can do a lot with that. But in practice, it happens that none of our clients really share that with us. It's starting now. So there's just it's probably just, it's slow moving industry perhaps. And even documents, obviously there's a lot of document forgery fraud, but even that, it has taken quite some time for insurance companies to, now they are able to share documents with us. But before that, just because they have this old legacy system where sometimes, well, it's not that easy to just extract this kind of data. But yeah, so every time we have these new situations, then we have our R&D teams who are then able to attack it from a new perspective, and then kind of apply the same methodology, but with different models to try to find more fraud.
Do you also use social media data?
Yes, we do. We do use some social media data that we actually crawl automatically, and there are some restrictions to it. But yes, it's part of our model.
Ville, do we have time for one more question, or are we running out of time?
I think we have time for one more question if you have.
Okay, so I think there's one, maybe a short one here. Okay, maybe you answered part of it before. So while building your model around customer behavior, right, that are indicative of fraud, how do you ensure that it is not intrusive? I guess perhaps the question relates to the privacy, right, of the users.
Or the ethical bias, maybe?
Or the ethical bias, right.
So one important thing is that we detect behaviors. We don't profile. We don't detect profiles. We will not say this person has this profile, therefore the person is more. It's more probable that this person is a fraudster, because again, this cannot be justified. What matters is are the facts. And so we'll say this person did this, and at the same time, this other did this. This is too much of a coincidence, and then we find that there's this inconsistency. So the behavior is suspicious. So from the start, the models don't go on that path. However, we all know that AI models can always, at some point, contain some form of bias, and this bias can be unethical. Unethical depends on society. Each society will have its definition of what it is. But let's say our Occidental societies have similar definition. And so the only way we have to do that is doing regular audits. So regularly we audit our models to ensure that there are not unethical bias. So far, we have never detected anything, and if there were, then we would reverse to previous version quickly, and then rework that to see how we can avoid it.
All right, Antoine, I think actually almost out of time. I was thinking if I could jump in for one last question to Eric, since we have you here. You have founded an extremely successful AI company. Now, looking back at your journey, is there something you wish you knew back then when you started that you know now? Any sort of a quick piece of advice to the starting founders of AI companies out there?
It's probably more the opposite. I think if we had known all the problems that we would face, I don't know if we would have started. Our biggest problem has always been that we only sell to insurance. We work in the insurance industry, but we are startups. So our investors always like startups to go fast, because startups are supposed to go fast, but the insurance industry doesn't. And sales cycle in our situation are not fast. And so we always need to find a way to manage that. So yeah, had we known that, we probably would have been less naive. But so yeah, sometimes naivety is good to keep the enthusiasm and just tackle the problems one by one.
That's what I guess that's what ChatGPT does it as well. One word at a time, one problem at a time. Great. This has been fantastic. I think for the interest of time, I think we should stop here. Thanks a million times, Eric, for joining. This is super interesting. It's so great to see you and hear about all your thoughts on these various AI-related topics.
Thank you,
Eric.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody for joining.